Buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti a questo incontro del Festival Internazionale a Ferrara. Oggi parleremo della politica del compromesso, come accedere alle popolazioni in pericolo. Con noi David Rieff, giornalista e scrittore statunitense, Jean-Hervé Bradol della Fondazione Crash di Medici Senza Frontiere e a moderare l'incontro Monica Maggioni del TG1. Le lascio subito la parola. Grazie.
Grazie a tutti, buongiorno, good morning.
Morning.
So, as Stefano was saying, we're going to try to debate this policy of compromise. How far can we go when we have to reach populations, when we have to deliver help, and how are the humanitarian organizations working these days? Which are the issues, which are the challenges, and we're going to discuss about this with Jean-Hervé Bradol and David Rieff, but also with you. So we'd like to have a circular discussion about these two topics. David and Jean-Hervé are writing a book together, and there's a book in progress these days, which is going to be called Agir à tout prix. And the sense of this book is about the main themes we're going to approach this morning. So, first of all, David Rieff, how far can we go in compromising, if we should start by the top of the question?
Well, let me start by saying that I don't think there's any other choice but compromise. I know that the younger, I would bet quite a lot of money that the younger you are in this audience, the less you believe what I just said. But I think it's the idea that a humanitarian agency, let alone an individual actor or a human rights worker, can be absolutely pure is just a fantasy. The question is not whether to compromise, it seems to me. The question is what kind of compromise and how in situations where relief workers work, which is what we're meant to be talking about here, whether the situation in practical terms has changed historically, whether this moment is different from previous moments. I think Jean-Hervé, who's the practitioner, I'm an interested and intimate observer, but no more than that. So I'm going to shut up in a minute. The only thing I would say is I think it's very important when you think about anything, but certainly about the history of humanitarian relief, not to be nostalgic, not to imagine that there was some time before where things really worked and now we're in some fallen time, a kind of Bible story in effect made secular. Usually the past was just as bad as the present.
Jean-Hervé, David was saying, forget about not compromising, but things are changing. So which are the biggest change you had to face, and which are now the issues that you're facing these days?
Well, that's true that over the past 20 years, our context of intervention have changed. One of the major developments is what we can call a certain level of militarization of humanitarian action, because due to the post-Cold War condition, it was possible to launch a new set of international military operation with or without a United Nations mandate to provide, aiming at providing either protection for population or to help delivering relief. And of course, humanitarian action is all about demilitarization of relief. That's the starting point to decide that even within an army, the medical sector is not a fighting one, and is identify for that with specific flags, specific emblems. On the second key aspect of, or I would say principle of humanitarian action, is the fact that the health care delivered or the material relief delivered will be indiscriminate. You will help all sides according to needs of non-combatants. And of course, when you're under the pressure of people running military intervention almost on your behalf, you know, how is it still possible to pretend that you are not coming with a violent wing? You are not the exploratory mission of an imperialist movement in a way. And we have to know that today, United Nations troops, for instance, the second army deployed worldwide in operation after the US Army. So that's a major development, a certain level of militarization of relief operation. The second major development is the emergence of an international criminal court. When you're going to deal with a local commander at the field level, you tell the guy, let me operate, and I will be not participating to the armed conflict. I'm going to be non-violent, a non-violent actor, and I will treat indiscriminately people who, according to their needs, to their medical status. But if, in addition, you have to tell this very military commander that you also could be a potential witness against him in front of an international tribunal, the type of relationship that you develop with people you are negotiating with change. You know, that those two recent developments, past 10 years, past 20 years developments, have drastically changed our working conditions.
David, I'm afraid that this point is very important. The idea of not being able to be out of what's happening, and in some cases, given the fact that there's an international tribunal that does exist, you could be also a witness. So there's a problem of role, how you reshape this role, provided that impartiality, neutrality are words that have to be redefined in some ways.
Well, they partly need to be redefined. I mean, what Jean-Hervé said before, which is that the idea is to provide, and it's the correct word in any language, indiscriminate needs-based help, let's say not targeted to one side, but purely available in principle, if you can get it to the people who need it, to all sides of non-combatants. So in that sense, impartiality is still absolutely as valid today as it was in the time of the founding of the Red Cross in the 19th century. But, of course, the things have changed. In a way, if you think about your own reactions to the International Criminal Court, most people of goodwill, one bien pensant, whatever you say, there's no word for that in English, but sort of people who would like the world to be a better place and a bit more equal and a bit less monstrous, supported the International Criminal Court, including most of the major humanitarian relief agencies. What perhaps none of us saw clearly at this time of the signing of the Rome Treaty that established the court is that all good things don't go together. We thought that, I think many of us thought that we could have humanitarian relief and that would perform caritative functions. We could have human rights work and that could sort of perform, if you like, democratizing functions. And then we could have the court, which would hold accountable people who committed grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions and crimes against humanity, etc. It didn't turn out that way. It turned out that all good things don't go together. And not only don't go together, some good things get in the way of other good things. As Jean-Hervé was saying, if you are trying to assure a commander on the ground that you are not a belligerent and your status in a zone where emergency relief, particularly medical relief, is needed, has to be or should be non-belligerent, although we can talk about Afghanistan and we'll go on to the examples where this isn't true. But if the commander sees you as a potential establisher of facts that will put him in jail, get him arrested, taken off to The Hague, and there are examples of this in many places, the most obvious being Sudan, but it's increasingly on the minds of leaders. I would say also, and I think this is an important thing to keep in mind, that one of the things that's changed in the last 20 years is the reemergence of strong states in the global south. Let's say 20 years ago, relief agencies, human rights workers, representatives generally of the global north could operate more or less as they pleased in the global south. Today, you have strong states, whether you're talking about Sri Lanka or Ethiopia. There are many examples. Rwanda was the first example, of course, of this, where they're not going to let outsiders do what perhaps outsiders think, according to their own deontology, is necessary. They're going to want to say, and this criminal court thing is a big part of the say. It looks like, it seems that the Sri Lankan government committed major war crimes at the end of their victorious war against the Tamil Elam, the Tamil Tiger insurgency. They wouldn't let anyone near that. And those who got near were forced not to say what they knew. And then you have this terrible decision. Is justice more important than aid? Is aid more important than justice? We're all faced with making choices that we didn't think we were going to have to make 20 years ago.
And exactly on this, just to go on practical examples, how do you behave when you have to make this kind of choice? I mean, inside the humanitarian organization, how do you evaluate?
Well, for instance, in Somalia, if you today want to intervene in the most affected areas, they're under the control of an insurgent group named Al-Shabaab, more or less affiliated to Al-Qaeda. And of course, they collect taxes. You know, you want to open a surgical mission in their controlled territory. You find a place, an hospital, you find staff, you start negotiating, and then they are the local authorities, you know, and they want to collect taxes from you. Taxes meaning thousands of US dollars almost every month, and they also take taxes from your employees. And you certainly know that with those taxes, they fuel their war economy. They buy weapons with those taxes. In one hand, you're authorized to operate war-wounded people, and in another hand, you're fueling the war economy. Otherwise, the war-wounded are abandoned without any kind of surgical care. So you're permanently try to weigh, you know, in one hand, how many surgical operations have you performed in a month, what amount of money you have given to local authorities to be authorized to do so. That's the kind of very concrete dilemmas. And even if you find a balance, a setup, you're sure that the further development of the political or military situation will break this deal in a couple of months, and you will have to restart from the beginning negotiating your working condition.
David, I think that what is very important in what Jean-Hervé was telling us is the fact that everything is very complex, it's very articulated, while seen from public opinion, it's very black and white. So, fill the gap.
Well, I mean, first of all, NGOs are somewhat responsible for the public's, for the simplification, because a lot of advertising by emergency relief groups tries to simplify. Some organizations are worse than others, but there's too much of this is the worst disaster ever. Oxfam is famous for this. So you have an inflation of casualty figures. It now, for example, looks that considerably fewer people died in the Haitian earthquake than was at first assumed. Enough people died that it's truly horrible. But there was a mood, particularly in Washington and at the UN, to exaggerate it, so that, and NGOs and Haitian officials all went along because they thought, in my view incorrectly, in the long term, that the more you say it's a disaster, the more attention and money, etc., you get. So once you enter the logic of public relations and fundraising, you're in a logic of simplification. I mean, that's a fact. And also, I mean, I don't mean to blame the NGOs or people like me who write about these questions. The public wants simplification. I mean, the public gets what it pays for. You know, the public is not innocent in this. That's why NGOs often have these appeals for what they call forgotten crises, because people like some. It's almost sort of grand guignol. You know, the bigger the bloodshed, the more attention is being paid, etc. And usually, the public will focus on one, like a kind of serial monogamy in a sexual life. You go from one, you know, catastrophe, and then you leave that catastrophe and take up with another catastrophe, etc. But usually the catastrophe you've left is still going on, as with, I'll give you one example recently, the Pakistan floods. The Pakistan floods have been completely erased from the public consciousness, I think it's fair to say, in Europe and in North America, partly because people have mixed feelings about Pakistan and don't give as much, but partly because the Somali famine is all people can think about at any given time. There's room, as it were, for one. And maybe that's normal. I mean, we're not altruism machines, much as some of us might wish it were otherwise. So how many things can you, I mean, if each of you just think, how many things can you care about? How many people can you care about? It's no different in public life than in private life. You don't, I mean, if you who live in this city, you don't love everybody in this city or really care what happens. You may wish them well, but, you know, you have your friends and your family and the people you love, and the rest, it's not so important. It's the same. And, I don't know how you get out of this logic. The one thing I will say is that I think it's a great mistake to exaggerate, because in the long run, I think people figure it out, and that in the long run, people just get cynical if you exaggerate every casualty figure. If you say each time there's a disaster, this is the worst disaster in the world.
Jean-Hervé, this is another way of compromising. I mean, finding the right balance between saying what's going on and driving attention.
Absolutely, because, for instance, in Haiti, example, figure in terms of deaths, wounded were inflated. Obviously, they are always at the very moment of the beginning of the disaster. And if you think twice about it, who could make census, field census in detail to guarantee the the solidity of data spread over the world. Nobody, of course, so they are just vague estimates. And they amplify the picture of the disaster. Also, the second step is to amplify the capability of the health system to respond to that, you know, pretending that you will fix social, political situation in Haiti where the state institutions are very weak, on pretending that you will do a kind of nation building or state building operation, or that you will be capable of providing real shelters for more than 1 million persons in some weeks. Of course, it's not true. And it masks other success, which is also interesting to discuss, because on another hand, Haiti was a very successful operation in terms of surgical care for wounded people, and a few months after for cholera patients. In 25 years of work, the first time that I see so many severely wounded patients being correctly operated, having second-line treatment. In a few days, almost everybody was accepted in a medical facility. Of course, we can still discuss the level of care. Maybe too many amputations were performed, etc. But still, it was impressive to see that many patients operated and treated in a so short period of time.
To go back to on compromise issue, does it ever happen that you decide not to go into a country because the level of compromise is too high or too low?
Yeah, certainly. It's always a drama. You know, one of the good examples is after the genocide in Rwanda. The perpetrators of the genocide, they fled in neighboring countries, Congo and Tanzania, and they were controlling the refugee camps there. So they were rebuilding their forces, taking advantage of the aid, the food aid, but also salaries provided by the relief operation in refugee camps. So the initial phase was very severe in terms of mortality in these camps. We accepted to work in those conditions for a few months, a year at the max, but then we quit the camps because we realized that we were feeding the perpetrators of the genocide, and of course they were regaining capabilities to be military active against the Rwandan population and the new Rwandan regime. So we quit, we closed the operation, and of course it's a drama because you do that because militias are controlling the camps, but on another hand, 70% of the camp population is made of women and children. You know,
so you have to leave them aside.
So there is a sacrifice to make. So, well.
David, which is the limit again?
I think it's, look, I think any choice is, like any choice in life, is going to have its negative side. There are very few choices that are so obvious that you can expect not to be regretful, even if you think you've made the right choice. I certainly think the choice in Rwanda was a correct choice. There were also a decision made by MSF and others not to work in North Korea for the same reasons. Well, not for the same reason, but because the food aid and medical aid was generally regarded as being used by the regime only for the third of the country or so that supports the regime, the military, the official, the bureaucracy, et cetera, and their families and to some extent their clans. So, I mean, we have examples. I mean, this book is called Agir à tout prix, and that is acted. Question mark.
There's a question mark
it's
at
not
the end.
called, yeah, I mean, it's not called sort of don't act unless you're guaranteed paradise or something.
We want you on board in this discussion, so if you have any question, please feel free to raise your hands at any moment, because we want this to be a circular discussion. So, are you, while we wait to see some... Is there one?
Middle there.
I can't see exactly because of the lights.
Center, there's a gentleman, I think, with his hand.
There's someone who wants to intervene? Please, feel free.
Or... No. Well, we'll
here.
go on board.
Okay, here.
Yes.
Yeah, that should be fine.
My name is Tiziana Prezzo. I'm a reporter at Sky News Italia. I want to ask you something about Haiti in particular, since I was there after the earthquake. First of all, I was struck by the fact that everybody was there in order to help. There were so many people, so many organizations, UN and everything, that it was very difficult to really help people. I remember once that I was in a camp where there were people standing in line, they stood in line for the whole day, waiting for their portion of rice. They stayed for 7-8 hours under the sun. And at the end of the day, there was just a bunch of Brazilian UN soldiers distributing this food. And at the end of the day, the majority of these people didn't get anything at all. So but at the same time, I remember there was an airborne unit, American unit there. And I was struck by the fact that these military people were perfect in organizing and distributing the so-called K rations to the population. So I didn't understand how it was possible that soldiers and military were helping the population in a more effective way than NGOs that were immediately there. And the second question that immediately came to my mind was, well, I was very ignorant about Haiti, I have to admit. I was so sorry that I didn't know how poor this country was, and I had to wait for an earthquake to know. And I think that many people in Italy didn't know that much. So why the NGOs were not there even before, where the poverty was so incredibly, I would say, offensive, and they just waited for the media and for the, you know, as you said, the idea that there was this incredible situation in order to help. That's a bunch of
Hervé.
But in fact, NGOs, they were already working in Haiti. It's for decades. And after the question is, was their work very efficient in terms of development? And I agree with you, you were shocked in Haiti by the high level of poverty, the total lack of public services in education, in health, in any aspect of the social life. But what you've seen about food distribution at the beginning of the relief operation, the audience has to understand that's normal. You know, first, that's for sure that militaries, they have a stronger logistic than the civilian sector. So, well, if you need a huge food distribution in a very short period of time, well, some armies have much better capacity than the World Food Program itself. That's obvious. And if the situation is not a civil war, let's use them. That's a kind of compromise that you make, for instance, not being embarrassed by the American army or the UN troops distributing food in Haiti because they
there was there was a big difference between the Americans, for example, the UN. UN was not working at all.
Yeah, but the US army has a certain level of efficacy. But at the end, what you should also know, that armies or civilian sector pretending that they will organize a food distribution in a couple of weeks for more than 1 million people, in the real world it doesn't exist. So most of the food supply was done by Haitian population itself, you know, and that's not the only example, because there are also a kind of misleading ideas about foreign intervention during disaster. during disaster, most of relief is done by local people. You know, of course, when it means complex surgical procedures in a country like Haiti, you have an advantage to use foreign teams because there is a lack of surgical services, a chronic lack of surgical services in that country, non-available equipment or staff. But for most of the food or water issue in Haiti, it has been fixed by the population itself, the local institution, for instance, families and churches.
Yeah. Yes, but David, I think she raised a very good point in saying that sometimes one of the issues is coordination. Coordination in action and among the different agencies, among the different organizations. This is a very frequent scene in disasters situation or in war zone, that you have the sense that some organizations are working in a conflicting way.
Yeah, but I mean, it's important again. I mean, I want to echo and perhaps amplify a little bit what Jean-Hervé said. First of all, it's the nature of a disaster that it takes people a while to get organized properly. So the idea that somehow all over the world, in Niger, in Sudan, in Haiti, you're going to have pre-positioned logistical teams that will be able to do mass feedings completely efficiently, that's not a realistic supposition. The specific thing you saw with the Brazilians, I could tell you stories privately about what the Brazilians, you know, the morale of those particular UN forces is poor. But again, what are you going to do? There, the force commander is a Brazilian. What's going to happen? The Italian government is to say, no, we don't like your job you're doing, you go away. You know, the UN is also a system, and Brazil runs that operation, but there are problems with the operation. That, again, is the real world. I think the real question here is whether, you know, where, at what point NGO activity becomes less helpful. And there is probably a point where you could be getting in the way, in some instances, of local capacities. But again, you know, these are disasters. They don't call them disasters because they're easily solved. And the last point, just about the problem in Haiti, actually, is the opposite of NGOs not being involved. The problem with Haiti is that for the last 75 years, NGOs, particularly church groups, have been relied on by a Haitian elite that didn't care about its own people to provide minimal services and take up a burden that government should have been performing.
Absolutely, and I want to go back to the idea of compromise because I think that's very important, but let me just clarify. Le domande dalla platea possono arrivare anche tranquillamente in italiano, abbiamo la simultanea e scusatemi di nuovo per la voce, quindi sentitevi liberi anche di porre domande in italiano. Okay, so, but let's make a difference between the disaster and the war area or places where there's a political need for compromise. Because in that case, the political aspect becomes much more important.
But all disasters are political.
Well, but in the case of...
that has a double meaning, especially out here, but that's fine.
I understand that, but I do understand the double meaning. But, I mean, there's a man, speaking of Haiti, there's an American physician who's run an NGO in Haiti for the last 30 years called Paul Farmer, who runs something called Partners in Health, which has been active in Haiti. It's active in about 10 countries, but it's had a particular focus on Haiti from its inception. It's connected to the Harvard Medical School. And, you know, Paul Farmer has written many books about Haiti, and he always makes the point that, obviously, the earthquake is not a political event, but the lack of capacity to cope with the earthquake is a political event. You know, in Fukushima, in Japan, the Japanese government was grateful for the help, and the Americans had one specific technical capacity about building transportation hubs, which they've obviously learned to do in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes.
So they could do this one very specific thing that the Japanese military couldn't do as well. But otherwise, obviously, Fukushima happened, and the Japanese coped with it. That's a political reality that makes for less of a disaster. But again, it almost never happens that the effects of a disaster don't reflect the political realities in a country.
In disaster situation, you always have two key political issues. Why the disaster wasn't prevented, if possible, and the second issue is immediately why the response to this disaster is not better. And of course, for the people who are in power, it's very destabilizing, this kind of question running all over the society. So, for instance, in infectious disease epidemics, it affects a lot the possibility to intervene. For instance, a cholera outbreak, the local government never wants it to be known abroad, you know, because it's a shame not having a clean water system that could have been prevented by a better water supply, on better sanitation, and even the response could always be more organized, but it's still a complex one. You have to hospitalize a lot of patients severely dehydrated. On many countries are lacking this kind of capacity, this kind of hospital capacities. So in cholera, you have a lot of tension with power. You cannot even pronounce the name cholera. Usually it's rephrased as severe watery diarrhea, or there is a number affected, epidemic 01, but nobody is allowed to pronounce the word cholera. In epidemic of meningitis, it's exactly the opposite, you know, because doctors are saying that the meningitis epidemic is spread by the wind, you know, so the local power cannot be made accountable for the emergence
yes,
of
because it's
the epidemic. On the response to meningitis epidemic was massive immunization, so giving a shot of vaccine to large segment of population. That's paid by the international community. For once, states who are not doing much thing for their citizens having meningitis outbreak the opportunity to show each individual that the Ministry of Health is caring for them, and each of them is going to receive something, a vaccine shot. So let's say that usually local authorities, they help you a lot during meningitis outbreak. So you could say, no problem, it's good, let's take the opportunity. But then it's going to be a bit more complex than that, because mass immunization during a meningitis outbreak that has already started is not very efficient. You consume a lot of manpower, a lot of vaccines, a lot of cool box, a lot of transport. But if you make the epidemiological study at the end, the number of cases avoided, the number of deaths avoided, has costed a lot of money for small numbers. So you have to deal with that, you know, because you will receive a lot of pressure coming from the Minister of Health to set up large meningitis campaigns.
Because in some ways you become a tool, a communication tool.
The benefit for the power is obvious. You know, they can play the kind of play where the state is protecting the citizen without being accused of having neglected the issue, on having neglected the prevention of the disaster. So for them, it's a good opportunity. So they put a lot of pressure on you to participate to the show, even if you know that technically that's not the best option in terms of public health.
And how can you react to this? Because I think that in some times the challenge could be that they can ask you to go away, or you do this, or you don't stay in the country.
But you try to build alliances on that. That's that's where the concept of neutrality is a bit more flexible than it appears when it presented in a kind of dogmatic way. You know, sometimes you have to find alliances. In terms of alliances, that's for sure that during the Cold War, for instance, a lot of refugee situations, people fleeing Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Ethiopia, and a lot of people were fleeing, let's say, communist regimes. So that was for sure that the Western side was useful in a way to set up a relief operation for refugees to guarantee their protection. So during this period, we had a lot of Western friends in the US administration, in some Western Europe countries too. But then when the Cold War ended, we had a lot of tensions with them due to their new military intervention. So that's how we try to play, to build alliances according to topics and to move them when we need to move them. And that's what we call a bit of political autonomy for humanitarian actors.
David, and then we go back to the...
No.
Ok, c'era qualcuno che voleva? Prego. Viene raggiunta dal microfono. Ok, so.
I speak in Italian.
Perfetto.
I temi che voi state toccando sono molto complessi. Mi chiamo Donatella. Sono molto complessi, cerco di dire un'unica semplice cosa. Giustamente David ha detto in una scelta ci sono sempre il lato positivo e il lato negativo. Allora noi qui stiamo cercando di parlare di compromesso. Mi viene da dire, forse non è anche il caso di farlo con noi, cioè parlo delle ONG, che noi intendo l'ONG, la comunque associazione che va a intervenire sulla situazione umanitaria difficile. Non è che forse in questo senso dobbiamo fare un compromesso, a me viene da dire forse un passo indietro, e mi spiego. Allora, l'esempio del Ruanda che è stato fatto prima da Jen, giustamente diceva noi abbiamo lavorato, abbiamo fatto tutto quello che potevamo in una situazione disperata, poi a un certo punto ci siamo accorti che stavamo alimentando una parte, tra virgolette, che si stava ricostruendo magari proprio una parte di quelle che aveva causato tutto questo dramma, no? E quindi ce ne siamo andati. Allora io mi chiedo, è una domanda che faccio ovviamente a voi, che cosa non noi come questa ONG, in assoluto un'ONG, cosa ci va a fare quando interviene in una situazione umanitaria? Va per aiutare proprio quelli che subiscono prima di tutto e che sono vittime del sistema, lasciamo perdere quale, politico ovviamente, perché è stato detto dietro ogni cataclismo poi c'è anche un problema politico. E quindi l'obiettivo suo è questo, no? Ecco, allora è possibile, e parliamo di questo compromesso, arrivare a salvaguardare solo, permettetemi la semplificazione, queste vittime che rimangono, perché nel momento in cui l'ONG se ne va da Ruanda con questo ragionamento assolutamente condivisibile, ma veramente noi a quel punto, come dire, rinunciamo, no? Rinunciamo, cerchiamo, i miei termini sono un po' semplificati, io non sono...
ma è chiarissimo.
Lasciamo, ma crediamo veramente che poi questi che avevano scatenato, che noi stavamo anche foraggiando, non ce la possano fare in un altro modo, troveranno un'altra strada, ma noi lasciamo le vittime che lo erano prima e lo rimarranno dopo, perché dubito che non trovino un'altra strada, no? Allora, capisco che è complicatissimo, lontano da me ogni tipo di giudizio su questo, però mi viene da pensare, ma non è che noi invece vorremmo intervenire un po' di più in quel meccanismo anche politico, e quindi quando vediamo che non ci riusciamo perché purtroppo i nostri soldi per aiutare le vittime vanno a foraggiare gli altri, allora vorremmo intervenire noi per evitarlo e non riuscendoci lasciamo tutto? Perché ho l'impressione, per noi intendo dire noi che diamo gli aiuti, ovviamente la mia è una nozione ampia, ho l'impressione che invece Noi abbiamo ancora un po' questo difetto un pochino colonialista, permettetemi il termine in senso buono, tra virgolette, che uso, di volere poi entrare in un passo ulteriore.
Insomma, lei dice come se non ci bastasse aiutare le vittime, punto.
Ecco, se il nostro obiettivo è quello, il passo indietro io lo intendevo rispetto a questo. Se è possibile, io chiedo a voi, cioè io non sono certo quella che può fare o dare risposte.
David, Jean-Hervé.
Well, I mean, well, first of all, let me say the simplest part of your question. I mean, obviously, there's no single answer to this, but I mean, the answer to can you only help those who need the help and not involve yourself with helping other people, the answer to that is no, never. Because you're talking about a whole society. You can't intervene and then sort of say, well, I'm only for the victims. Incidentally, victims is a very dangerous word because it deprives people of their agency. You can be a victim and a victimizer, for example. You're not just an innocent victim. Those camps were full of people who were both victims. I mean, the Rwandese camps were full, particularly in Zaire and what's now the RDC, were full of people who were both, who needed help, but also were victimizers. I mean, look, in any patriarchal society, that's even true within a family. So the idea that you can separate these things out, whether it's colonialist or not, you know, frankly, that interests me less as a problem, either in the negative or the positive. I mean, I'm interested mostly in the results. And I think the one danger about events like this, and it's certainly my fault, probably more than anyone's, is it's important to remember that this aid is not about proving a theory. It's about delivering services and skills and materials. And it should be judged on how well it does that, not on whether it has pretty theories. But think for a second about the argument, how can you only assist the people who need the help and not assist the others? To do that, the only way you could conceivably do that would be in the context of conquest, where you would become, or the states where you come from, would be the government. Imagine, for the sake of argument, that a foreign institution came to Italy and said, we don't want to pay taxes to the Italian state because what we do is much too important. Most Italians, I think, would find that unacceptable. Well, why shouldn't that be true in Rwanda or Ethiopia? And certainly, is it up to the NGO to say to Jean-Hervé's example, Al-Shabaab, sorry, you are, in fact, the people who rule this place, but we shouldn't have to cooperate with you. You should just leave aside why then they should cooperate. But, that's the way it goes. I mean, states or powers, whether they're formally states or not, tax people. There's no way short of conquering them that you're going to change that system. So, this book is called Should One Act at Any Price, under all circumstances. I mean, but even where it's clear you're going to act, some of what relief does is always going to be negative. That's just the way the world is. It can't be any other way because that's life. I think there's a great mistake in imagining that public life can be more pure than private life.
Jean-Hervé, it's well deserved.
No, but concretely, in an example like Rwanda, for instance, during the genocide, there was a radio station broadcasting messages aiming at spreading over the genocide. that was radio genocide in a way, radio Milcolin. Radio Milcolin. And once the opposition fired a mortar on the radio station, and one of the main journalists was brought in our hospital with two legs destroyed by the explosion. So, look, we were not very, very keen to receive him. You know, it was one of the main perpetrators of the genocide. But wounded himself. So, as doctor, we were forced to treat him, even if we deeply dislike it. And a couple of days after, the guy recovered, and he wanted to continue to launch appeal for the genocide within the hospital. You know, he was calling colleagues, etc. So we had to deal with that. And in another hand, we were also very pleased to have him in our hospital, because it was showing that our hospital was not opposed to the interim government who was carrying out the genocide. So it was a kind of security for us and for our wounded patient, who otherwise they would have been killed. You know, they would have been slaughtered because of being opponents, because of being Tutsi. So that's the kind of compromise that you make. You know that you will fuel the bad side in a certain proportion, and you compare to the number of lives you can save on the other hand. And it's a dirty work, you know, because you're always walking a thin line. Very frequently you make mistakes. Remember, you're a foreigner, you are not perfectly understanding the context, the social relation, you're rarely speaking the local language, etc. So you can totally misinterpret the situation surrounding you and make severe mistakes.
It's so strange to hear you speaking about a dirty job, when normally this is represented with a lot of rhetorical attitude, saying that it's the angels going here and there helping people. So I think this could help a lot in understanding the complexity of the job, even changing a little bit the kind of communication that most of the time comes out when you deal with humanitarian organizations.
But in that job, your best friends are bad guys, because if you want to obtain authorization to operate, in a way you have to seduce them, you know, to be close to them, to know their relatives, to understand their ideology, their culture. You try to develop interpersonal relationships, because tomorrow you will be in their offices asking for a permission, asking for a travel permit, etc. So that's for sure another aspect of the work that is never portrayed in a way. But they are the condition to success in operation.
Prego. There's a question out here. Un'altra là in fondo, due, poi leggiamo.
Volevo fare una domanda al signor Rieff riguardo alla critica rispetto alle organizzazioni non governative, ma non rischia di essere una critica fatta all'anello più debole della catena, perché in effetti le organizzazioni non governative, come diceva anche il signor Bradol, contribuiscono solo in minima parte, quindi in un certo senso questa critica alle organizzazioni non governative è la critica all'anello più debole di una catena in cui ci sono stati, organismi internazionali che non fanno il loro ruolo, e quindi le ONG sono lì proprio per quel motivo. E poi un'altra velocissima domanda al signor Bradol. Nel mondo delle ONG c'è stata una riflessione negli ultimi tempi rispetto all'accountability, rendere conto non solo a chi dà i soldi, ma anche nei confronti della popolazione che riceve aiuto, e se questo in un certo senso poteva contribuire a ridurre o a semplificare qualcuno dei compromessi a cui bisogna far fronte nel lavoro.
David and then Jean-Hervé.
Okay. Well, I'm always for attacking angelism. in all times, in all circumstances. That's what I do. But I mean, the more serious answer to your question is, I don't think I don't think trying to point out the failures of the NGOs, and particularly the subject that I'm interested in at the moment, which is this hyperbole about casualties and suffering, which is something I've been writing a lot about lately. That doesn't preclude me from attacking, to use your image, stronger links in the chain. I mean, I spend quite a lot of time attacking my own government on subjects that rarely have that much to do with relief aid. But I don't think the NGO... I agree with you that, you know, if you looked at the world's ills, you know, what the problems with the NGOs are probably quite low on the list. But first of all, I don't think that should give them a free pass. And second, it doesn't stop me from doing other things. It's just, we're talking about relief aid. If Internazionale had wanted to have a conference about Barack Obama, I would have.
So that's going to be next. Jean-Hervé, and I wanted to add something on accountability.
I'm not sure I understood precisely the question.
The thing was how accountability should work, not only towards those giving money, but also towards population there on site.
Right.
But on this, I would also add, when an organization is well established, like MSF, 40-year anniversary right now this year, how the bureaucratization of the organization has an impact on all this as well. So if we can just...
Well, that's for sure. Over the past 20 years, the aid system has improved, the performances. If you look at food relief operations, they are far from being satisfactory from a population point of view. It takes time to set them up and to have them performing. But if you compare them to those 20 years ago, it's a huge improvement. You know, you have less and less famine inside refugee camps, and they were very common years ago. So, but let's say that this working environment has professionalized. So we have all spent time in building our own institution to try to get a bigger budget, to employ more staff, to be more prepared, to improve our technical capabilities, etc. But all that has a price. You then have to run a very big institution, and sometimes when you look at some relief programs, you wonder, are they open to feed the system, or are they open to help the situation? Sometimes an organization needs to have a program in Somalia, for instance, because Somalia is on TV, and if you don't have a project on countries that are on TV, it fragilizes your institution in terms of fundraising, in terms of public image, etc. So you see many programs that are open only for that reason. People who launched them knowing from the very beginning that they are not going to be successful because there is too many constraints, etc. But they still need to be open. So that's another parameter to control if you want to success in this kind of work. It's the degree of bureaucratization, of self-interest developed by a relief institution.
And how about accountability towards the population you're going to help?
Towards the population, no, it's really, but the population understands much more things than what we think. You know, for instance, I think no Haitian ever thought that they are going to be fed by the relief system after the earthquake. So many of them were waiting for some kind of distribution, but most of them get organized by themselves. Also, an example in Haiti, what was really striking, it's how the work that was to collect the wounded person who were still under the rubbles. You know, many foreign teams were sent to do that job, maybe almost 100 with a field hospital, etc. But most of the jobs was done by family members, neighbors, local Red Cross volunteers, and maybe the foreigners, they got out of the rubbles 150 persons, but the locals, they had to deal with tens of thousands of wounded. So the population has a huge experience of what are the performances that they can expect from each organization. Now they have a culture of the health system, and of course, based on that, you can potentialize your operation if you transfer responsibility, if you share responsibilities with population members, with population groups. And for instance, in major relief operation, it boosts a lot the quality of the aid delivered.
Okay, there was a question there.
Spero dunque, responsibility to protect, il problema del compromesso, cioè il limite massimo del compromesso. Penso allo scritto di Weissman che dice not in our name, e la posizione di MSF è molto chiara su questo. E la posizione di David sul suo primo libro, Un giaciglio per la notte, e il suo secondo sulla punta del fucile, in cui forse cambia un po'. Chiedo, rispetto alla responsibility to protect, Libia, oggi, il significato di essere come MSF in Libia, all'interno di una logica di attori dove i militari, gli interventi sono a più livelli, li chiamano ribelli, poi c'è la NATO, la Cirenaica, cioè, capisco che è delicato, ma come concilia MSF la posizione not in our name sulla R2P e il suo intervento in Libia?
By speaking out about those military interventions that presented itself as promoting democracy, humanitarian standards, humanitarian rights, and taking public position, clarifying that we don't believe in that. We don't believe that relief has to be brought by armed forces, for instance, and we are still advocating for a non-violent way of action. But in the same time, we do operate. For instance, we had an operation in Misrata when Misrata was under siege. But also in Libya, it's not that complex because in real terms, it's a small relief operation. Because Libya is a rich society, there are a lot of qualified, for instance, medical staff, surgeons, a lot of solid medical facilities. So what we did in Misrata, we did a bit of surgery that when our Libyan colleagues were overloaded, you know, but that was not a major operation. So that's why we worked with the opposition in that sense, in terms of surgical services and in terms of medical supplies some days for their hospitals. But that was not major. And in another hand, we were criticizing the NATO countries about their declaration, pretending to act on behalf of noble cause, democracy, humanitarian action, human rights. So it was not that difficult to run both actions together.
David, you want to react about not on...
Obviously I'm not in a position, I have no right to speak for MSF.
Not for MSF, but on the general
I think the question, to extend, I mean, I think R2P is a fraud. I think R2P is Kouchnier's old idea of humanitarian military intervention repackaged in this slightly more attractive format. The people who started R2P, like the former Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans claimed that it was something new, but I really don't think it is. It's about, again, Jean-Hervé referred to the UN's being the second largest deployed military in the world after the United States in foreign theaters of war. The R2P gives them a set of laws that allows them to authorize invasions of weak, monstrous governments, and never, of course, of strong, monstrous governments, rather like the International Criminal Court. But I think the issue actually presents itself more for agencies that take a lot of government money, which is not the case, obviously, with MSF in war zones. Because for those agencies, it becomes very difficult to refuse to be in these places if they want grants in other parts of the world. There's tremendous private pressure, sometimes public, but tremendous private pressure on, say, mainline U.S. agencies to be in Pakistan and Afghanistan doing programs that on strictly development or emergency grounds are not licit. For example, if you look at USAID grants in what used to be called the Northwest Frontier, that is north of Peshawar, in the administered area, these areas that have a special juridical status under Pakistani law, the Americans you can follow the aid flows directly to where the combat was. So when the combat was in Waziristan, the money was for development projects in Waziristan. When it shifted, when there was that brief offensive near Islamabad and they were very close, it went down there. Now it's back up in these tribal areas. Very difficult if you're also getting funds for programs in Guatemala, in Chad, in Timor, wherever, to say no to that stuff. In fact, I think, I wish, just as a matter of honesty, of course they'll never do it, that the American aid agency, the U.S. Agency for International Development, would just say we have one standard for war zones and another standard for the rest of our work. At least everybody would be clear about what was going on.
But how do you explain to the population the difference between agencies? I mean, a population that sees, foreigners coming from abroad with a project, how can they be aware of the differences?
Well, I mean...
There's no way.
Well, there are ways. Sure there are ways. I mean, there are ways of... First of all, some agencies, MSF is a good example, have made enormous efforts to be in contact with the other side in these wars. I mean...
Well, but honestly, even if we pay a lot of effort from a population point of view, foreigners are foreigners most of the time, and they associate Western NGOs very frequently to Western military forces. It's only at the very local level that those who are directly profiting from cares, for instance, for medical cares, can understand that's not the case,
Questions? One here. C'è una domanda qui. Prima è da un po' che aspettava qui e poi c'è un'altra.
Thank you.
Prego.
I wanted to ask if, do you both think that the international framework of aid would have been more effective in the last 20 years had that been supported and ratified by the United States government? I'm talking about UN conventions, I'm talking about the International Criminal Court, and so on.
No, is the short answer. I don't think the international... On the contrary, what we were saying earlier was the existence of the International Criminal Court has actually, with or without American ratification, has made for problems for NGOs to work, precisely because local leaders who may be guilty of various crimes or grave breaches of the conventions are afraid that what NGOs see on the ground will be used in evidence against them. So I mean, you know, during the Bush administration when it rained, I used to blame Washington for it, but and Obama's not that much better in my view, but I don't think you can blame the Americans for this at all. I don't see that remotely, because the things the Americans have not signed are all human rights documents. It's by no means clear that the work of emergency relief, which is what we're talking about here, would be made easier by human rights. Indeed, as I was saying a minute ago, it's arguably, you make a very strong case that the ICC makes the work of emergency relief operations harder. So I don't see how a bigger U.S. commitment, willingness to ratify everything from the Ottawa Treaty to the Rome Treaty would change the situation of emergency relief. You could argue it might change the situation of human rights, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Un'altra domanda c'era? Eccola qua.
That's for David. According with the author of Tokyo Vice, the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, played a main role after the earthquake in Japan. So in your opinion, what's more important, the actor or the efficacy?
Well,
Going to the Yakuza limit, which is kind of far.
We very frequently work with, how to call them, you know, for instance in Somalia they are called warlords, you know, kind of businessmen with a militia. And a mafia can be one example. That's for sure that sometimes we deal with mafia. We've dealt with the Albanian mafia, for instance, in Kosovo to launch a big shelter operation after the comeback of refugees. Houses were destroyed, especially roofs were burnt out, and we wanted to distribute iron sheet and on wood to repair houses. You know, if you don't organize it with the mafia, with the local mafia, it's not going to happen. But you have to be very clear and very cautious about the share that the local mafia will take on the operation. What are you going to accept? A 5%, a 7%, a 10%? Sometimes more, you know, because if they give their authorization, most of the time they're asking for something which can be material, a bit of money, a bit of equipment, or something that can be more symbolic. You going to a farewell party with them to show the population that they are good people, really acting for the community, that's satisfied by foreigners who are attending that very farewell parties, for instance. And of course, it's a choice. And we do both choices, accepting sometimes and refusing. And we try to understand what we can gain in any situation and how far to compromise. Where we don't compromise too far, it's about the use of violence, you know, or the discrimination among needies. That's the 2 points where our limits are. But even there we are sometimes flexible.
Credo abbiamo tempo ancora per un paio di domande e poi ci avviamo verso la conclusione.
Buongiorno, volevo chiedervi un vostro commento su come è stata gestita l'emergenza umanitaria a Lampedusa dal governo italiano, perché in un certo senso anche lì è necessario un compromesso fra una parte politica del nostro governo, l'Unione Europea e la reale necessità di aiuti a queste popolazioni che arrivavano nel nostro Stato. Quindi appunto volevo chiedervi un commento a proposito di come è stata gestita.
David, you start first. Or Jean-Hervé, se come vuole.
There are local authorities everywhere, and let's say they are legitimate on whatever you find, a local traditional chief, the head of a militia, the governor of a region, a minister, state institution, you will have to work with them. And of course, there are some good and bad aspects in this kind of relationship, but as David mentioned, you cannot be in a very isolated position to be pure, not to try to dirty your hands all the time. So if you want to operate, you have to compromise with European Union representatives that are very aggressive towards migrants, but helping migrants, it's also obtaining authorization from them to have a relief operation at a very spot where migrants are arriving. So yeah, you're forced to compromise.
Sure. David.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to that. I think it's very important to understand that the human rights model, which is absolutist, is not relevant to emergency relief. I'm not even sure it's relevant to development. I'm not even sure it's relevant to human rights, but that's another conversation. But you could make the argument that a human rights activism has to be law-based. There are breaches and there is conformity with the law. And really there isn't that much room for maneuver for a human rights activist. But that's not what emergency relief is about. Emergency relief is about working largely with people who you don't approve of. And that it's irrelevant. I mean, the question is not should one compromise, is one going to compromise, but the question of MSF's book, which is should one always act at any price, which is a very different question. Even, of course, the human rights movement makes more compromises, particularly in treaty negotiations, than it admits. But again, you can't expect to suddenly have relief agencies who can say to to use the Lampedusa example, who say to the Italian government, we don't like your migrant policy, but we would like a free hand to operate in Lampedusa. Sorry, that's not the world. You know, if you want a government that has a different immigration policy, you know, vote one in or vote one out. But so far, at least in this country, that hasn't happened, has it?
But it's important. You know, if you want to understand if you have been too far in compromising, you know, the only way is to publicly debate it, you know, because there is no global theory about humanitarian action that you can use to judge your operations, you know. You will judge your operation by exposing the information, exposing the weaknesses, exposing the bad aspects of what you have done, and trying to have a kind of public debate, a democratic debate about it, and certainly at least with the population that is going to be served by your operation. And there is a room for improvement in that sense, because usually institutions like ours, we are a bit reluctant to publicly expose that we are not only feeding starving children, but we are also sometimes feeding mafia guys in a corner to run this kind of operation, but that the only solution to fine-tune our action is to accept, to expose that publicly, and to hear your reaction, to discuss it with you. That's the goal of the book in that we are working.
Thanks again. The last question. L'ultima.
Sì, cercherò di essere breve. Siccome c'è anche il business della guerra, così c'è anche il business della pace e delle organizzazioni umanitarie. Quindi la mia domanda è nel senso che un'organizzazione umanitaria per esistere ha bisogno di paesi in crisi o di paesi poveri, altrimenti non ha più il senso di esistere. Quindi è possibile una fattibile soluzione a risolvere queste problematiche ritirando le organizzazioni umanitarie, riportare un equilibrio nell'Occidente, trasportare queste forze a riportare un equilibrio nell'Occidente e così pian piano con le sue forze i paesi in via di sviluppo trovano un suo equilibrio.
Cioè, tradotto, perché non ho capito benissimo, tradotto mollarli?
No, non mollarli, nel senso non possiamo continuare a dare delle stampelle, oppure un bambino per imparare a camminare prima o poi deve reggersi con le sue gambe, passo dopo passo. Così se noi continuiamo a star lì, le organizzazioni umanitarie comunque per esistere hanno bisogno di paesi in crisi, altrimenti non hanno senso.
Ma credo che comunque quelli in generale esisteranno comunque, ma scusate, non è il mio ruolo di entrare nel dibattito, quindi prego, Hervé, David. Jean-Hervé, David.
Yeah, but the world where you are let alone with your own issues is not existing anymore, and it has most certainly not ever existed. So you always have foreign intervenants in your situation. So it's going to continue that way. But you're true in stating that many of the issues will be solved by people themselves. For instance, economic development or developing a correct health system is not going to be done from abroad by external intervenants. So that's for sure. We have to recognize our limits, and AET was a good example this morning to discuss for that. That's realistic to expect foreigners to come for giving a hand to treat an exceptionally large number of wounded persons. But that's unlikely that those foreigners, they can meanwhile rebuild your house, feed you immediately, etc. So that's where sometimes we have to refrain ourselves to pretend that we can solve issues that are unsolvable by foreigners.
David, if you want to react, or
yeah, it's a nice metaphor, this, the peace and war, but frankly, war is a lot more serious. I don't think that the real problem in the world is, that the crisis zones are crisis zones because aid agencies are perpetuating these crises. Maybe you could find an example somewhere, but I don't know of one. I think there are plenty of places where the work of aid agencies has been unsatisfactory, but again, there's a kind of condescension. Even your thing about children walking step by step makes me nervous, I have to confess, as an image of this transfer, because for the obvious historical reasons. I think it's very important to see emergency relief, humanitarian action, in its proper size. It's not the main actor, except for very short periods of time, at the very beginning, particularly in epidemics or situations where there are mass casualties of one kind or another, more generally. Otherwise, it plays an important role, but hardly a crucial one. So if you're asking why they're crisis zones, look at the American Empire, look at EU agricultural policy, look at Islamic, the Al-Qaeda world that's, instituting these rather quite monstrous regimes in various places, including the Al-Shabaab in parts of Somalia. I think it's unfair to saddle the world of emergency relief with principal responsibility for these events. I don't think they should either be given the credit when things start to go well or the blame because the world is the same old slaughterhouse it's always been.
Okay, so we arrived towards the conclusion. You're not going to tell us which is the answer of a Girard-Dupri question mark?
It has to be a question mark.
This is going to stay as a question mark.
Question marks are good.
Question marks are good. So thanks so much. Please, Hervé.
No, that's it.
That's it, because I want... So, that's it. Grazie a tutti voi. Non era un tema semplice e l'abbiamo trattato, credo, con qualche complessità. Grazie a tutti.